Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Life and Legacy. What would I have done? What would I have done as a follower of Christ and as a citizen of Germany during the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich? This is the question that Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. And yet, as we will see, there's far more to the life and legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer than the answer to just this one question. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born on February 4th, 1906 in the city of Breslau, Germany. He arrived 10 minutes before his twin sister Sabine and was 6 out of 8 children. His father Karl was a highly regarded psychiatrist and professor, and as such was able to provide his large family with a high degree of comfort. Dietrich's mother, Paula, was the daughter of a pastor. Trained as a teacher, she ensured all of her children received a good education. In 1912, Karl was appointed to teach at the University of Berlin, where he moved the entire family. As the 6th of 8 children in a family of overachievers, Dietrich felt the need to distinguish himself within his family. One way was through his musical ability. He excelled at the piano and guitar. Another way was through his career choice. Around the age of 14, he announced that he would pursue studies in theology. Although Dietrich's mother came from a family of pastors and theologians, his choice to pursue theological studies was not obvious. For one thing, his family did not participate regularly in the life of the church. Dietrich's fathers and brothers were cautious agnostics. So why did Dietrich announce so boldly to his family that he would pursue theology? One of the primary reasons was ambition, not divine calling. He felt that, given the enormity of his father's reputation and the success of his older brothers as scientists and lawyers, he would need to forge his own path as a theologian and pastor. His conversion would come several years later. Dietrich's pursuit of theology was not born simply out of a desire to be a standout in his family, though. The Great War deeply affected the Bonhoeffer family when their eldest son Walter was killed. In addition to struggling with his own grief, Dietrich saw the devastating impact Walter's death had on his mother, and this kindled within him a fervent longing for the life beyond. In 1923, at the age of 17, Dietrich began his theological studies at the University of Tübingen before transferring to the University of Berlin in 1924, where he would be influenced by the theology of Martin Luther and the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. In 1927, at only the age of 21, Bonhoeffer completed his Doctor of Theology dissertation entitled Sanctorum Communio, a work we'll examine in more detail later. Soon after graduating, Bonhoeffer decided to pursue ordination. He accepted a call in 1928 to serve as a pastoral assistant at a German congregation in Barcelona. While there, he had several opportunities to develop his preaching skills, to which people reacted enthusiastically. People also responded to Bonhoeffer not only because of his preaching skills, but because of the obvious manner in which he cared for the young people of that congregation. He managed to grow a Sunday school from 1 student to 40 students over the course of just a couple of months. One of the reasons he was so successful was the way in which he cared for and visited the families of this German community and discipled their children. It seems that the seeds of community and discipleship, 2 things that would later define his passions, were planted during this time. In 1930, Bonhoeffer pursued an opportunity as an exchange student and traveled to New York, where he studied at Union Theological Seminary. During that time, Bonhoeffer met 2 men who would make a lasting impact on him. The first was his classmate, Frank Fisher, who was of African-American descent. Fisher introduced Bonhoeffer to the community at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, where soon he became an integral part of the community, worshiping there regularly and teaching Sunday school. As someone so intimately tied to this community, Bonhoeffer became aware of the incredible struggles and injustices the black community faced. His experiences with racism in America would no doubt later shape his views of Nazi Germany. The other person to significantly influence Bonhoeffer during his time in the U.S. was the French minister Jean Lasserre. Lasserre, a pacifist, encouraged Bonhoeffer to re-examine his relationship with the Word of God, to not just see it in terms of an intellectual or philosophical material, but to find its relevance in the real world. This led Bonhoeffer to read Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount in a new way. He was captivated by the simplicity of Christ's command to love and to make peace. Bonhoeffer left the United States in 1931 a changed man. Interestingly, the Germany to which he was returning was also undergoing radical change. The Nazi Party was beginning to garner national support. Then, in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed as Reich Chancellor, and all of Bonhoeffer's greatest fears were realized. Fascism, racism, and war would soon grip their entire country. In the midst of all this turmoil and uncertainty, a significant thing occurred for Bonhoeffer, something he called his grand liberation. The seeds of change that had been planted in him in the United States now grew into a converted life. The following is a quote that gives critical insight into his transformation, and as such must be quoted at length. In a letter dated from 1936, he wrote, "I threw myself into the work in a very unchristian and rather arrogant manner. A mind-boggling ambition made my life difficult and separated me from the love and trust of my fellow human beings. At that time, I was terribly alone. Then something different happened, something that has changed my life, turned it around to this very day. I came to the Bible for the first time. It is terribly difficult for me to say that. I had already preached several times, had seen a lot of the church, had given speeches about it, and written about it, but I still had not become a Christian. I had turned this whole business about Jesus Christ into a kind of crazy vanity. It was from this that the Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount, freed me. Since then, everything is different. That was a grand liberation. There it became clear to me that the life of a servant of Jesus Christ must belong to the church, and gradually it became clearer how far this has to go. Then the troubles of 1933 came. They only strengthened me in this. I now saw that everything depended on the renewal of the church and of the ministry." Bonhoeffer set about working towards the renewal of the church. His stance as a church leader against Hitler's regime became increasingly difficult to maintain when most of the churches in Germany showed support for Hitler, at first out of a sense of patriotism, and later out of a sense of fear. Things came to a head in 1933 when the Nazi Party consolidated all of the German churches into a single state church, the Reichskirche. Bonhoeffer, along with several other pastors who were resisting Hitler and the Nazis, formed the Pastors' Emergency League. This group resolved to stay true to the Christian gospel and to give aid to the victims of Nazi violence and injustice. Soon more than 7,000 pastors had committed themselves to this underground movement, which would eventually come to be known as the Confessing Church. After this, Bonhoeffer left for London to serve as a pastor for a time, before returning to Germany in 1935 to serve at an underground seminary created by the Confessing Church at a place called Finkenwalde. Here he was able to put into practice the ideas about community and discipleship that he had only previously been able to write about. Seminary training and community life revolved around practices of communal prayer, biblical reflection, acts of service, and lectures given by Bonhoeffer. During his time at Finkenwalde, he also produced two of his most influential works, The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together. The Gestapo shut down this illegal seminary at Finkenwalde in the fall of 1937. After Finkenwalde was closed, Bonhoeffer continued to train pastors as best he could in what was a kind of wandering seminary, visiting and encouraging pastors at their parishes. However, Bonhoeffer could not hide his frustration at many of the church leaders whom he felt were dodging their responsibility by standing idly by while leaders of the Confessing Church were being persecuted and while the Jews were facing even harsher treatment at the hands of the Nazis. He would frequently cite Proverbs 31:8, "Who will speak for those who have no voice?" He used this as a reason to be that voice for the defenseless Jews. Partly fueled by this sentiment and partly in an effort to avoid conscription into the German army, Bonhoeffer accepted an invitation to America to return there in June of 1939. However, after only a month there, Bonhoeffer realized that he had made a mistake. His place was with his people in Germany. Bonhoeffer returned to Germany in July of 1939. When he returned, he found himself under the scrutiny of the Nazi authorities for suspected involvement with the confessing church, and he was placed under regular surveillance. Bonhoeffer was granted unexpected freedom, though, when his brother-in-law Hans von Dohnanyi, an agent of the Abwehr, or German military intelligence, secured him a position within the Abwehr in 1940. Not only did this free Bonhoeffer from Gestapo surveillance, it also brought him into the inner circle of the German resistance. Dohnanyi was involved with others in a plan to overthrow Hitler, and Bonhoeffer would soon become involved in their plans. As a member of the Abwehr, Bonhoeffer's official mission was to use his pastoral and ecumenical visits around the country as a cover for gathering intelligence. What happened in reality, though, was that his work with the Abwehr served as a cover for operating as a courier and an agent of the resistance. He was also able to feed information to the Allies using his ecumenical contacts, and he was able to help some Jews escape Nazi Germany. From this period in Bonhoeffer's life comes what he considered his most important theological project, the book Ethics. In January of 1943, Bonhoeffer became engaged to Maria von Wedemeyer. Their engagement was cut short, though, by his arrest a mere 3 months later. At first, the SS were only able to bring vague charges against him and sent him to Tegel prison in Berlin, where he would remain for a year. Then on July 20th, 1944, an assassination attempt on Hitler failed. Information soon surfaced showing that Bonhoeffer was connected in this plot against Hitler, and he, along with many of his co-conspirators, were transferred from prison to prison until they arrived at Flossenbürg, Germany. There, on April 9th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged. Throughout much of his life, Bonhoeffer was a man committed to understanding and to living out the will of God through the turbulence of life. The same can be said of how he died. The camp doctor at Flossenbürg wrote of Bonhoeffer's last moments, "I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. In almost 50 years that I have worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." For someone who only lived 39 years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer left behind a remarkable legacy. His life and his thought became so deeply focused on the person, example, and grace of Christ that it is not difficult to see the Christocentric focus of his writings and in his lived experience. Questions continue to remain, however, about his legacy in light of his involvement in the plot to assassinate Hitler. How are we to best understand the seeming contradiction between his earlier pacifist leanings and his involvement in a conspiracy to commit murder, albeit of a genocidal dictator? Perhaps the best way to look at this question and to summarize his larger legacy is to briefly examine his major theological writings and to see how his thoughts and actions interacted with one another and the impact he had on history. Sanctorum Communio, Bonhoeffer's doctoral thesis, was completed in 1927 when he was only 21 years old. Act and Being, part of his postdoctoral work, was completed 3 years later after his time in Barcelona. Both of these works show that in Bonhoeffer's earlier adulthood, it was apparent that his focus was more on philosophy than on theology. But although these two works were academic in nature, they would help inform his later passion for community and for the church. These works also left an impact with later theologians and sociologists. Ernst Wolff remarked years later that these works were probably the most penetrating and perhaps the profoundest treatment of the issue of the structural nature of the church. The Cost of Discipleship was written in 1936 and is deeply rooted in Bonhoeffer's experience and reflections from his time living in community at Finkenwalde. This book focuses on the person, image, and example of Christ and our response to him in obedience. As disciples of Christ, Bonhoeffer sternly warns us not to fall into the trap of what he calls cheap grace, a grace that he saw preached all too often and lived too often in the state churches of Nazi Germany. In his words, cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. Bonhoeffer urges and encourages us, therefore, to fight for what he calls costly grace, a grace that is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. And what cost God much cannot be cheap for us. In 1955, none other than Karl Barth remarked that discipleship was by far the best thing written on the subject. Nearly 6 decades after Barth made these comments, discipleship continues to be an invaluable resource for committed followers of Christ. Life Together, written in 1937, is a continuation of the work he began in discipleship. Bonhoeffer wrote this work after the seminary at Finkenwalde was shut down by the Gestapo, and it's a reflection on the practices and experiences of that community. Again, there is a very strong Christocentric focus in his writing. Christian community means community through Jesus Christ and in Jesus Christ. There is no Christian community that is more than this, and none that is less than this. We belong to one another only through and in Jesus Christ. Bonhoeffer's thoughts, though, were not intended to isolate Christians apart from the world. Rather, he saw the necessity of the Christian community living out its missional mandate in the world. He writes, "The Christian cannot simply take for granted the privilege of living among other Christians. Jesus Christ lived in the midst of his enemies. So Christians, too, belong in the midst of enemies. There they find their mission, their work. There they will be the seed of the kingdom of God in all the world." Ethics was written between 1940 and 43 and is often referred to as Bonhoeffer's magnum opus, even though he never had a chance to complete the work. In it, we see him struggling to define what a Christian ethic truly is. The question he asks is not, "How can I be good?" or "How can I do something good?" but rather, "What is the will of God?" This question was not merely theoretical for Bonhoeffer, but came from a deep place of struggle. Ethics was written during his time as a member of the Abwehr and as a participating member of the resistance looking to overthrow Hitler. How was he to reconcile what he had learned from the pacifist Lasserre and the Sermon on the Mount with his participation in a plot to take Hitler's life? Although this question is not addressed explicitly in his writings, one does get the sense that in the midst of his wrestling, the answer was once again found in the person of Christ. He writes, "Christ does not teach an abstract ethic. Christ did not, like an ethicist, love a theory about the good. He loved real people. He was concerned whether my action now helps my neighbor to be a human being before God. Thereby, we are turned away from any abstract ethic and toward a concrete ethic. We can and should speak not about what the good is, can be, or should be, but about how Christ may take form among us today and here." Whether Bonhoeffer's participation in the plot to assassinate Hitler was consistent with this ethic has been and continues to be the subject of much debate. Bonhoeffer himself clearly wrestled with this, admitting that an ethicist cannot be a person who always knows better than others what is to be done and how it is to be done. What is clear, though, from ethics is that Bonhoeffer continually sought to find Christ and to find a way to help people learn to live with others during the fog of war in which unspeakable atrocities were being committed by a genocidal dictator, and while much of the church stood idly by. While the last few years of Bonhoeffer's life make for the most dramatic and intriguing reading, It would be a mistake to try and define his legacy by them. As we have seen in this biography, it is in observing the entirety of Bonhoeffer's brief but remarkable life that we can begin to appreciate his impact on the history of Christianity. From his beginnings as an ambitious and bright young academic, to his time worshiping in Haarlem, from his time living in an underground Christian community, to his final days spent in a German concentration camp, we can see how God formed his heart and his mind as Christ became his center, especially in turbulent times. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has left us with some of the most profound writings and examples of Christian discipleship and community. There is much we can learn from him, even as he learned to follow Christ.